Now, as I stated in the previous segment, we will be using Ubuntu for the full course. So I will now cover how to actually download it and install the distribution. And I'm currently at ubuntu.org. This is the simplest way to actually get the Ubuntu distribution. If you hover up to the top where it says downloads, click the down arrow. That will get you the Ubuntu desktop. And the current version right now is 20.04. And I always recommend people use the LTS, which stands for long-term support. This release has the longest support time versus any of the others. Now, you can also install the Ubuntu server version, but it doesn't have a desktop environment. And like I stated earlier, there is a Ubuntu Core or Ubuntu for IoT that you can actually download for your mini boards like a Raspberry Pi. Now, in order to download it, all you have to do is click on the 20.04 and that will start the download. And it only takes a couple minutes depending on your internet speed. But you want to go down and download this, and then I'll be back once it's finished to go through the install with you guys. So now that we have Ubuntu downloaded, I just wanted to talk about the couple ways that you can install Ubuntu. Now, there's the direct way. There's also a way to install it in a virtual machine, as well as you can install it within the cloud. But most of the times people install the server edition in the cloud because they may want to set up a web server or something to that effect. Now, you can install it directly to your hard drive, but I definitely don't recommend you do this for this course unless you have a secondary computer, because when you install it directly on your system, you have to make sure you have a backup of all your files. And since we're just going through a course and a simple introduction, I don't want people to go through this and mess up their computer by not having backups, lose files, and don't have a way to recover them. And then also when it comes to a direct install, you have to write the ISO to a USB or a CD, which will cause a little bit more confusion than necessary just to go through and follow and run a couple commands that I'll teach you through this course. So the main way I want to show you guys how to install Ubuntu is by using an application called VirtualBox. Now, Oracle VirtualBox is a type 2 hypervisor, and also VirtualBox can be installed on all three major platforms: Microsoft Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. And then also when you use VirtualBox, you have the opportunity to try the operating system before you actually commit to installing it directly on your hardware. And then also, one thing about VirtualBox, you have to have newer hardware, because the newer the hardware you have, the more likely that virtualization is supported through your processor. And since this is 2022, I know a lot of people are using newer laptops and virtualization is turned on by default. And I wanted to make sure I open this up to as many people as possible so they can go through the training successfully. Now let's hop over to my desktop so we can walk through installing Ubuntu within VirtualBox. Okay, so our ISO is downloaded and I have it stored in a folder, but this is what I actually downloaded right here, which is what you will receive when you hit the download button from Ubuntu. So you want to make sure you find that location so you can create the virtual machine. Now this is VirtualBox Manager. And it's a very simple application to use. It looks and feels the exact same way on all different platforms. So Windows, Mac OS, as well as Linux, it looks pretty much the same. And most likely when you first open this application, there won't be anything there. And I currently have some virtual machines already here. That's why they're listed. Now, in order to create our virtual machine, all you have to do is hit new. So we can hit new, and then what you want to do is name the operating system. Now, I know this is a Ubuntu system, so I'm gonna just put Ubuntu as the name. And you can also put the version number. Sometimes I put 20.04 at the end of it, and I'll do that for the the purposes of this video so you guys can follow along with it. Now you want to select the type. Now it'll automatically kind of recognize based on whatever you type up here, and it automatically pulled up Ubuntu down here, as well as the type, which is Linux. And if we click under here, I just wanted to show you guys the different options. But you have Microsoft Windows, Solaris, BSD, IBM, Mac OS X, and other. And what you want to do is make sure it selects Linux. Most of the time, like I said, when you type in the operating system, it'll automatically update here with the right information. And Ubuntu 64-bit. As you can see, when you click under type, it'll open and expand the different versions. And what you want to do is make sure it's on Ubuntu 64 bits. And so we're good there. We can hit next. And now this is your memory size. Now this is all dependent on the extra resources that you have on your system. Now my laptop has 16 gigabytes of memory, so I have some to spare. And for this demonstration, I'll just select 8 since I have the resources to spare, but you may want to select like 4 or 6 when it comes to this, depending on how much memory you have on the system. Now Ubuntu can actually run with less memory depending on the desktop environment. Like for instance, if you're using the XFCE version of Ubuntu, then you can probably get away with 2 gigabytes of memory, but I always recommend for people starting out, just give it 4 gigabytes of memory and you'll be good to go. So let's hit next there. Now we have to select our hard drive. And this is just a way to select if you already have a hard drive created. And what this is a virtual hard drive. It doesn't really exist. It's kind of like a container, so to speak. And I'm only using that as an example. It's not the actual application that runs containers like Docker, but it's essentially a containerized file that's virtual, that's used by the virtual machine where all your files will be stored. And it's looked at by the operating system as a real hard drive, but it's actually not. It's just created by VirtualBox itself. So what you want to verify is that you want to create a virtual hard disk now. So you can hit create there. And there are different types of hard disks within this application. There's the VDI, which is a VirtualBox disk image, VHD, which is a virtual hard disk, and VMDK, which is a virtual machine disk. And I know that's kind of confusing, but some of these is basically the format of the type of virtualized hard disk that will be used for this operating system. And the main thing that needs to be explained, the difference is there are other types of hypervisors out there that use a different format. For instance, I believe VHD is the one used by VMware. But we're not going to worry about that. We'll just use the VirtualBox disk image for this demonstration. So let's hit next there. Now, this is an important step that I always try to tell people when I'm teaching them how to use VirtualBox. There are 2 different ways of storing the data within the hard disk. There is dynamically allocated and a fixed size. Now, dynamically allocated means that the hard drive will only be as big as the actual files, and as you add more and more files to it, it will grow. Now with a fixed size, if you select a hard drive of 10 gigabytes, then it will take up 10 gigabytes of space on your system. So I always tell people to use dynamically allocated. That way it'll grow as you need it. It won't take away from the resources from your main machine. So let's hit next there. And as you can see, it will store the virtual machine in a location. I won't go too deep into that, but that's basically where the virtual machine is stored, or the hard drive itself. And then also the size. You can set the size as 10 gigs, or you can go even higher, depending on how much resources you have in your system. For instance, I have a 2 terabyte hard drive within my laptop where this is located. So that's why it's showing 2 terabytes, but you can't use the full 2 terabytes because, like I said, this is running on a operating system that's already installed. So if you don't have 2 terabytes, which I'm sure I don't because of all the files and folders and applications that I have installed on this system, I definitely don't have that space to give to this virtual machine. Now, you don't have to really worry about it if you select it dynamically allocated, because it will only grow to the size that it needs for the operating system and whatever files that you put on the virtual machine. But I always recommend people use like 10 gigabytes for just a install that you're doing for testing purposes. But let's go down and hit create, and that will conclude the setup. And that was basically the initial configuration of the virtual machine. We have to go into the settings and make a few more changes before we actually launch the virtual machine. So let's hit settings, and you want to make sure that that virtual machine is selected. That way it'll open up the settings for that virtual machine. And we don't have to mess with anything under general, but I'll go through and show you at least the tabs. Now there is a shared clipboard, drag and drop. You could turn that on, which I won't need that for this demonstration. You could write a description in there, and then they also allow you to create disk encryption if you want to. I recommend you don't do that, especially if this virtual machine is just temporary and you're probably going to delete it in the future. Now, if we go to the next tab, that's the system. You can make changes to how you set up the virtual motherboard, for instance. That's the base memory. And like I said, I gave it 8 gigabytes of memory, but you can select it, whatever. You can make changes there if you need to. And then also it has a virtualized boot order. So, like when you boot up a physical computer, it'll pop up with hitting either like F12 or F9 to select a different boot order, or select something to boot first within the order from the BIOS. Then you can make those changes here as well. And then some chipset information. You can enable EFI for special OSs if you need it. I don't recommend you select it. You can just use the default. Now under processing, you can give your virtual machine more processors, which I'll bump mine up to 2. Now I have a whole bunch of cores on my system because I'm using a Ryzen on my laptop. So you select what's best for you, but 2 cores is just enough for what I'm trying to do with this virtual machine, as far as just showing you guys how it all works. And then there is an acceleration tab, which we will leave default. Now under display, what I typically do is bump up the video memory to 128, and then enable 3D acceleration. And then there are some other tabs in here: remote display and recording if you need to. And then storage. This is where you want to add your ISO. So right now it's a virtualized IDE controller, which is the CD drive. And all you have to do is select over here what the little disk is, and you can find the ISO by clicking choose a disk file. And then all you have to do is go on your system now and find that ISO that we downloaded from Ubuntu a few seconds ago. And once you find that ISO, you just select it, and that will actually add it to the virtualized CD drive. And then as you can see right here, this is the hard drive that we created, the 10 gigabyte hard drive. And that is where the operating system will be installed. But this is needed in order to boot up the operating system in order to install it. And I just wanted to explain that for people that are very, very new, so you can understand exactly what we're doing. And this is similar to installing it on physical hardware, meaning that this ISO would typically be written to a CD or a USB drive, and you're basically plugging it in to your hard drive, and then your hard drive is booting this CD and then writing to your physical hard drive that's within your laptop. Now the rest of these options I won't go through, but it's basically the audio network settings. Now one thing you can actually change right here, which I didn't think about talking about, but they do have different types of networks you can set up, like NAT, which it'll basically use your IP address for this machine. And then they have bridged adapter, internal network, host only, which I'll just leave it on NAT so we can have internet for this virtual machine. And then also serial ports, USB ports, which I kind of leave most of this stuff off, or I turn it off. but you could just leave it the defaults. Now let's go down and press OK, and that's pretty much saved our settings for the virtual machine, and we can basically boot it up and start the install. So it's two ways to actually start it. You can double click on the actual virtual machine, or you can hit this down arrow, or you could just hit start. But they do have options under here. They have a normal start, they have a headless start, and a detached start. And what you want to use is the normal start, or just double click on the virtual machine and it'll start it up. And as you can see, it's popping up. It has our boot, order. It automatically recognized the CD drive that we had in the actual system. And then one thing with Ubuntu, it'll go through and check your files before it opens up the installer. Now, one thing that Ubuntu will do, it'll pop up with a installer right away as soon as it boots into the operating system. And there are two options. First thing you want to do is select your language. So if you're in a different country, you can select whatever language that applies to you. But since I'm in the US, I'm gonna select US or English. But the two options are you can try Ubuntu or you can install Ubuntu, which is what we want to do. We're going to install Ubuntu, but you can actually try the operating system before you actually do the install. And this is beneficial if you're installing directly on your hardware, because every now and then you'll run into a system that is not 100% supported. But this is very rare, but I try to tell people to use the try Ubuntu first. That way it'll verify that your system will actually run the Ubuntu operating system without any issues. And it basically boots up the system as if it's installed on the actual computer with all the applications and everything you want to do in order to use the operating system. You can get on the internet. You could play around with files. You could do pretty much anything you can do if it was physically installed on your hardware. Now, the only thing is, if you download files or install something or whatever, it's going to reset if you reboot the system. So it won't save anything, which that's basically called persistence. Now, let's go through the installer by just hitting install Ubuntu, which is what I want you guys to do if you're going through this course. Now, the first thing that'll pop up is the keyboard layout. So you select whatever keyboard layout applies to you. But since I'm in the US, English US, and then English US over here. And then you can also test the keyboard just to make sure that all the keys line up and all that stuff. So let's hit continue. And so it says right here, what apps would you like to install to start up? You could do the normal installation. Now, they do have a minimal installation. It'll come with a web browser and basic utilities, but I'll install the normal version so you can see all the software that's on it. And then the updates right here, it'll download updates while installing Ubuntu, because these packages or ISOs that are created are not always up to date. Like, they'll update the ISO, let's say once a month or a couple months, depending on the developers of the actual distribution. So sometimes you'll download an ISO and it's a couple weeks behind the update. So this will verify that you have a up-to-date machine as soon as you boot up the operating system and the installation is complete. So I'll just hit continue there. I'm gonna just leave the defaults. Now, this is a very important step. This is where you want to install the operating system, meaning the hard drive. And one thing it says right there, warning, this will delete all your programs, documents, folders, photos, music, and any other files on any other operating system that's on the hard drive. So if you're installing this on physical hardware, you want to make sure you have backups of all your files, because when you run through this installation and you get to this step, this lets you know that it's going to erase the hard drive and you will lose everything on the system. We don't have to worry about that because we elected to install it all on VirtualBox. So this is an empty hard drive or virtual hard disk with nothing on it, so we don't have to worry about it. But they do have options for you to set up the hard drive in your own configuration, which I won't go through. That's pretty much advanced. If you're just installing this to follow along with the class, then I recommend you select just erase this and install Ubuntu. And we could just click install now and it'll go through the install. And I actually forgot about this next step. The next step is going to ask you where you're located. I'm on the West Coast, so I select Los Angeles, which is super cool. And then also you have to select and create a user account. And this is something that most Linux distributions want you to do. They want you to create a user account and not use the root account, which I'll talk about later on in the course. And I'll change the computer name to Ubuntu 20. And then what you want to do is select a password or create a password. And so I'll throw that in there. And just to throw you guys a little bit more information, one thing, they do have two options when it comes to logging in. You can log in automatically, or you can require a password to log in, which I always recommend people use a password. And then with Ubuntu, they also have it to where you can connect to Active Directory. So if you understand Windows and Active Directory, you can add this system to Active Directory, which is a little bit outside of the scope of this course. So let's move on. Hit continue. And like I said, it's going through the install, and it actually doesn't take too long, but I'll be back when it actually completes. And so since the installation is complete, this will pop up for you. It'll basically say installation complete. You need to restart the computer in order to use the new installation. So all you have to do is hit restart, and this concludes the installation portion of Ubuntu for the course.